Welcome everybody to the third KICS webinar. It's the KICS EAP Hub, which stands for Europe, Asia and Pacific, but we also have countries from the Middle East that are part of our hub. A few words on KICS. KICS stands for Knowledge and Innovation Exchange. It is an initiative that is funded by Global Partnership for Education and administered through IDRC, International Development Research Center. And I'm extremely pleased to welcome Margarita Lopez. She is for our region, for our hub, and these are 21 countries. She's our counterpart. There are 3 other hubs all over the world, but the one for our region, Margarita, basically accompanies us through all these exciting events and initiatives that we have. Margarita, can I pass the floor to you? You are muted.
Yes, unmute. Thank you very much, Gita. So, good morning from Ottawa. I know that for so many of you, this is the afternoon now. So, very happy to be with you today and to participate briefly. I will just talk briefly this morning about KICS. But I'm very happy to know that this webinar is happening today, and with this exciting topic that I'm sure that will be all of us will be so inspired at the end. So maybe just a few words about let me try that about KICS. What KICS is? Do you see my screen now? I think yes. Okay, so very basic, just to remind some of the big concepts that are involved in the initiative. As Gita mentioned, this is an initiative that is a joint initiative between Global Partnership for Education and IDRC. So we are putting together these main broad concepts and words that are knowledge, innovation, and exchange. I think that we will have big success because we started just 1 year ago. We are living this crisis, this big crisis, unexpected crisis of the pandemic, and even with that, we are advancing in projects and calls and starting projects that are trying to go to fill gaps, on learning gaps, on how to improve education. So why these main concepts? We will be talking about knowledge. We need more knowledge about what is happening in education, and our focus is, okay, we are funding, we are supporting research for solutions. This is not like this theoretical big research. We are really going for solutions for the developing countries about how to improve education systems in general. But of course, we are really trying to see and to find innovations. And what's the meaning of innovation here? Because we can have okay, we can have different approaches to innovation. But of course, here we are talking about a broad scope of innovation. We're talking about tools, about programs, about strategies, methodologies. We are very broad about that. So we want to see what are combinations of factors that are meaning possible that innovation happen in the world and in the educational systems. So innovations are there changes, combinations of different aspects, things that are helping to improve systems in this moment. So our main point is, okay, we'll find innovation, how to scale these innovations. And this is our main objective at this moment. And through the calls, probably you have participated, you have seen calls that we launched in the last months in the region, for example. So the main purpose is how to find ways to scale this innovation. Not to scale, we are not funding the scale the proper scale, not the implementation, but how to scale all these interesting things that are happening in the world and that are happening in so many different developing countries, and then other countries don't know. They don't know what is happening. So we need to find a way to socialize that, to exchange knowledge. And this is the other like big circle here. This is change. So we are trying to mobilize this knowledge to fill these gaps. So mobilizing knowledge, and the hub is especially important for that. This is our one of the main purposes, if you want, of with the creation of hubs. This is like facilitating, supporting this exchange of knowledge. Of course, participating in the creation of knowledge, because hubs recently, for example, did an exploration and identified with countries. This is another important point in the program. We are inviting stakeholders, education stakeholders, to participate, to identify the main issues, the main priorities in the education and the national education systems, and to work towards the improvement of them. So I think that this is like the main and very broad, if I can present like the scenario, the main points of KICS. So of course we can elaborate more on that, and we'll probably find like connections, clear connections today with the presentation, with this approach to innovation, to design, how to improve education. So this is, we are all that, and I think that it's all what I can say from now. Just maybe insisting that we started with some research for solutions through the Global Grants project that we started last year, 12 global grants that are exploring in innovation and how to scale these innovations. We have a big project that is trying to identify the main points for scaling, how to scale all of that. And we are like now starting the regional calls that will probably start implementation or development, if you want, next year, at the beginning of the next year. So that's for now. So thank you very much for all of you. So enjoy the webinar, and I'd be happy to be here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Margarita and IDRC, for saying a few words. The KICS EAP Hub is all about giving voice and visibility to national experts that are all around the world, and especially from the Global South. This is our mission, and it's also a mission that NORAG shares. It's my great pleasure now to introduce you to Sina Mousayed. Sina is actually one of our own. He has a PhD in comparative and international education from Columbia University, New York. Soon after he graduated from Columbia, he worked for IDEO. For those of you who don't know IDEO, IDEO is this design thinking institution. It's, I think, maybe one of the oldest. Among others, they have designed the mouse, to be precise, the commercial mouse. And they have also designed the first laptop of Apple. And it's all about thinking out of the box. And as we all, and especially we have one course right now on scaling innovation, the word innovation is in everybody's mouth, and it means different things. And this approach to design thinking, the way Sina conceives it, is very much in a human-centered approach. So after working for IDEA, he now has his own, he worked for public and private companies, but also for the education sector and education in emergencies, I believe. And he is now the Chief Design Officer and works with many startups in San Francisco and abroad, and continues to consult with organizations on design thinking. The floor is yours. I'm extremely happy to have you here, Sina. I think you're one of the most creative thinkers that I know. Thank you so much for agreeing to come.
Thank you so much. You're too kind, Gita. Any credit that might go to me for goodness goes to you for all your work and mentorship. I'm going to share my screen now. Make sure it's up and running. Hello, everyone. Welcome from wherever you are. I'm happy to have you here. As Gita had mentioned, obviously my name is Sina, and I've been doing this so-called innovation thing for the last 10 years. And what really is special about this is not the name innovation, but the part of it that I really obsessed with is the human-centered part of it. I think as educators, those who are in the field as developers or as educators know people are at the heart of it. And oftentimes the answer to solutions for innovation are just resting inside people. They already know what they want and what they need. And perhaps we just facilitate the process of letting that come out. Usually, I will give this caveat, usually a talk like this, it gives you a taste of design thinking. So by no means is it comprehensive. I do this in one-day workshops or 3-day workshops, as well as 3-month projects. So just want to set the context that we're going to have 2 tasks ahead of us. One is to introduce everyone who may or may not be familiar with design thinking with the methodologies, but also how can it be applied to the education sector. That's in the classroom, school systems, as well as agencies. So hopefully by the end of today, or this little bit of time, we will have become familiar with some of the concepts and methods of design thinking. We'll explore ways of innovating in education. That is, trying out new ideas in real life contexts, as Margarita mentioned. Design thinking at the very heart of it, even though it has the word thinking in it, is all about doing and learning by doing. So hopefully we can introduce some of those concepts. And at the best, I hope people leave a little bit more curious about how they might apply some of the concepts in design thinking to your own work. And that includes the education space, but also in your teams and perhaps in your own personal projects. So I imagine that many of you have probably heard of the concept of design thinking, and like any other method or fad, it gets interpreted a lot of different ways. Maybe there's certain tastes or flavors of it that vary, but broadly speaking, design thinking started in the product space and it moved on to the service and then organizational spaces over the last 30 years. And IDEO, the company, is one of the pioneers of this methodology, which is human-centered design. But I suppose we should start by asking the question, what is creativity, right? So when we think of design, I think many of you are thinking of really nicely decorated homes or fashionable people. We associate creativity with painters and dancers, writers, musicians. But seldom, if you ask someone who's creative, do they think about physicists or activists, educators or chemists? But why? In the middle of the last century, in California specifically, there was a really buzz around, is there a science to creativity? Is there something that we can explain about people who are creative versus people who are not? And a lot of research emerged from that moment. And we'll jump into that. But the question you might be asking is, are you creative? And a lot of people that I speak to, the people that I've worked with, everything from CEOs to undersecretaries, ministries, nonprofit organizations, they often will resort to, well, I'm not a creative person. I'm not creative at all. But I want to challenge that. But so to do that, I want to try something pretty crazy. I've never done this on Zoom, but I want everyone, if you can, to grab a piece of paper, pencil or pen. If you have one around you, please do. Pick someone that you see on the screen. Now, if you can scroll down and just pick anyone that you see a picture of. You don't need to know them. I want you to then, dare I say, turn on your microphones. It's going to be crazy, I know, but let's just do it for a moment. And then when I say go, I want you to draw the person in the box that you've selected. So it doesn't have to be fancy. You can have a Post-it, you can have a marker, whatever. And what you're going to do is you're going to draw their face.
هذا على البطارية. خلاص خليها على البطارية.
So go ahead and unmute your mics for now if you can. If you can show your video, that's great. Or at least have a picture up. And you're going to have 1 minute, just 1 minute to draw the person when I say go.
Veronica.
Are you on online class? I don't know. What should I draw? Lots of people join.
это я сама, так сказать.
Ah, I lost it.
It's here.
Меня вы что-то говорите, не слышно.
Okay. Do you want us to turn the mics on, Sina?
Tina, микрофон.
You're muted, Sina.
Turn on your microphones and hold up your pictures.
Okay.
If you could write their names there. Oh, I see a picture of myself. Thank you, Melanie. Someone drew Gita, I see there. Yes. Yes. You're laughing. Okay.
Veronica.
Spectacular. Spectacular. You can go ahead and turn off your mics again. You can turn off your mics again. Okay, so why do I do this activity? So, like I said, there was a lot of research that was done in the middle of the last century, and a man by the name of Bob McKinn, who was an engineer by training, came to Stanford to do research on creativity. And this is one of the activities that he developed, one of the research activities that he developed, and he did it with all his students. And he did it with many different adults. And he found the same reaction. Didn't matter what context, what cultural background people came from, whether they were men or women, the reaction was similar. It was embarrassment. It was embarrassment and a little bit of shame and a little bit of, because they had to share these pictures with their peers. And there was snickering and apologies being going on, except there was one group that he did this with that didn't have that reaction. It was children of the age of 7 years old. And what he had realized was that at some point we associate creativity, which is given a challenge to solve with an original solution, with fine arts. And we kind of lost this kind of connection to our inherent ability to be given something to do and to accomplish that task. So when I talk about design thinking, I want people to just indulge me for this moment and to embrace the idea that you yourself are a designer. I mean, my background is not in design or graphic design or visual design. As Gita mentioned, it's in social science and education. But we are all designers by our very nature. Some of you may have heard of a furniture designer named Charles Eames, very famous mid-century, beautiful, slick furniture. But he went on to do some work for IBM to communicate abstract ideas and educational products for children. And someone asked him, what are the boundaries of design? And his response was, what are the boundaries of problems? Because the objective of design is to solve problems, is to make things more clear than they were before. Art makes us wonder, right? That's art. But design is there to help clarify and to make better. So since we're talking about the middle of the century, and this will all come together in how it impacts education, there was a product by the name of Kudal. It was a wall cleaner. When people had wallpaper, it was usually made out of some sort of fabric. And there was a grocery store that was very popular in the United States called Kroger's. They commissioned this kind of cleaning product company to come up with a substance that would clean the dirt off the walls, the residue that was left from fireplaces and coal stoves. But within 3 years, this product that was in almost every household in the United States plummeted down to 50% sales, and it kept going and down. Now, I'll ask you the question, and I'm gonna pop up my chat box here to see let me see if I can pull this up here. Where's my chat box here? Chat, here we go. In the chat box, could you please do me a favor and tell me why do you think Kudal stopped selling their products? And this is a little bit of a hint. Can you just write? You can just type in what you think. What happened in the world that all of a sudden half the population in the United States stopped buying this product? Okay. Yes. Yes, you're right. You're right on the money. No identification with the product. Got rid of coal and heat and otherwise. Correct. So what really happened was there was the invention of the gas stove, and electric stoves started to emerge. Also, polyester started to emerge as a fabric, which was easily cleanable. So no one needed this product at all. So they were in big trouble. So the founder of Kudal brought in his nephew, who was a really sharp graduate from an Ivy League school, super smart, whip smart, brought him into the big office, gave him a corner office, said, you can hire whoever you want. I want you to solve this problem. I want you to figure out how we can sell this product because no one's buying this product. So Joe started to sit down and he started to come up with ideas by himself with his team. And they said, can we sell this to bigger factories and railroad companies to clean the residue from coal from those places? But surely enough, the product was not strong enough for those environments. Then they thought about exporting it to other countries who still hadn't experienced gas stoves or electric stoves. But the export fees were too high. So Joe McVicker was about to give up. And something happened that he wasn't expecting. He had a conversation with his sister-in-law, who was a teacher. And in that conversation, he found a solution that would change the fortunes of Kudal forever. But I'm going to pause right there and we'll come back to what the answer was to that. Let's go back and talk a little bit about design thinking. So when we talk about innovation, it's really interesting because innovation is agnostic of sector, right? All innovation means is something that has not existed or a version of something that hasn't existed is now being created by other humans. But there's three things that usually have to go into play for this to actually be sustainable. Business is one of them. Is it viable? Can we actually make a profit of it? Or if it's a nonprofit, is it something that we can develop and put out in the world where people will fund it? Whether it's the government, whether that's funders, it has to be some viability to it, right? The second bucket is technology. And by technology, I don't mean electronics. I mean, can we create it? You know, in other words, at some point, people wanted to write down their memories, but paper was too expensive. The technology was sort of there. It was on parchment made out of animal-like skin, but someone created the pulp, you know, with paper, and you were able to create out of plants paper that was cheap and affordable and mass replicatable. So the technology was there. And then lastly, do people actually want that thing? Do people really desire it? Is it a need of people? And design thinking is purely approaching innovation, which is that middle area. It's a mix of those three, by starting with people first, by actually going to people and surfacing latent needs that might be there. In fact, I'm going to suggest that if you hear people talking about design thinking or doing design thinking, and they haven't involved people in the process, it isn't design thinking. There's a lot of critics of design thinking that point to the fact that there's a little bit of like a seclusionary vibe of designers coming together and there's an otherness to people and they're designing a solution for them. Well, that's typical design. That's not actually design thinking, because design thinking is purely about employing methodologies, much like another method like action research or things like this, with people. And that was the big takeaway that I had at IDEO, is that no matter what the product was, or the people were, or whether it was a school or a government or a startup, you're really dealing with the people who are actually participants, users, creators of that product. Simply put, there's a three-phase process to design thinking. The first one we often refer to as inspiration. In design research, this is the word we use, it's about collecting inputs that are going to help inform the design. So we're not in a validation state where we're wanting to validate my idea that I had, because that's not innovation. And I often mention this to our clients. I said, hey, you're coming up to us with a problem, but are you prepared to be wrong that you're asking the wrong question? And I think people who are in the research field can realize this. We go in with a hypothesis and we have a theory of what we think is the solution. And then we go out and we just employ it without actually testing it to see, is this actually the right question that we're asking in the first place? So there's a few methods that go along with that. The next phase is once you've collected those insights and interpreted those insights, you start to generate a lot of ideas, a lot of concepts that might be hitting on those needs that you've identified in the field from the research. And then finally, you don't stop at the idea phase, but you actually want to take it out in the real world and test it. We call these prototypes, or we call it ideas in action, which is you want to create a small microcosmic kind of space where you can see the thing that you've designed in motion before you decide to scale it. And I think this is really important, given that one of the topics of this forum is scaling innovation, because design thinking was designed for just that before investing in really expensive technology, or dare I say, even more importantly, fields that are more sensitive like healthcare or banking or education, where little changes can mean great inefficiencies that affect people's lives, you don't want to scale something that you have no idea if it's going to even have a resonance with the audience. Now, obviously, I'm a fan of process. I went through my own training as a doctoral student. You really respect that there's processes and methodologies to sound things. Creativity is no different, and design is no different. There is a rigorous design process to design thinking with these three phases. And there's these two things that happen at any given time. Evolutionary-wise, human beings have evolved by coming up with an idea, and whoever can come up with the idea the fastest and execute the right answer the fastest survive, right? So if I saw a tiger approach me, I didn't have time to explore, like, hey, I wonder if this can be a pet or not. I want to give it a hug and let's see what happens with that. Or I should kill it. Maybe he'll be offended. No, it was the person who either ran away or was able to kill that predator that survived. So we are naturally inclined to reward people who come up with the answer the quickest. But in design and innovation, there's an inherent inefficiency to it, right? Because you know what the right answers are. If you have the answer, it's not innovation, right? Because you're exploring to see what are the possible solutions. And so remaining in an ambiguous state is actually very important. There's this really great phrase where someone said to Einstein, you know, what is it about you that makes you smarter than other physicists? And he said, it's not that I'm smarter than everyone else. That's not the case. It's that I stay with the problem longer than anyone else. In other words, trying to keep yourself from jumping to a solution is what makes you innovative. So there's this idea of when you go out to explore and you're taking all these insights in, you're open to new possibilities of changing your direction altogether. And then you converge and try to interpret what you've found out in the field before you go again out and come up with a lot of concepts. Again, we're diverging, and then picking a few of those concepts that you might feel fit that feasibility and that viability bucket, and then coming up with a selection process. So again, I hope for the rest of the time that we have together, I'm going to go through these three phases fairly quickly and give some examples in education of how this looks and feels. But the reality is that this isn't simple, and emotionally speaking, this is a very frustrating process. And like I said before, the person who is the most innovative is the person who stays with ambiguity the longest. So when you're in that inspiration phase and you're going out and do research, it feels like this. It feels chaotic because you think that you knew what the right questions were, but you realize quickly that there's new opportunities to explore and which ones you actually latch onto. And then you come up with an idea and you feel very confident about yourself. You're like, yeah, I got the idea. This is it. This is what's gonna rock people. I'm gonna get a Nobel Prize now. And then all of a sudden you go out into the field and you test it, you prototype some of it. And again, you get confused. You learn a bunch of new things. You learn that maybe what you thought was the winning answer was not. And what you thought was a minor answer is exactly the key. So I just want to share with you that there is a reality to the emotional journey of this that we can't ignore, that nothing is so clean cut when it comes to innovation. How design thinking is applied is pretty wide. Like Gita mentioned, products was where IDEO started. So the Apple mouse, furniture, things, you know, things that you actually do. But part of the design thinking process was bringing on anthropologists who had a lot of experience like working and observing people's behaviors into the design process. And we realized that even with services like healthcare or banking or even security and even education, it started to become something that you can apply to it. And then finally, organizations, designing actual organizations using design thinking became a very popular movement in about 10 years ago, where big organizations, before they rolled out different changes to policies or through practices, we're able to do design thinking methods to test out concepts. And then finally, in the last 5 years, one of the things I had the privilege of doing, and it was fun and it was scary, was can we use design thinking to design movements, or at least social movements within organizations or within particular sectors. And I just want to give you this range because it can be applied in a multitude of ways, much like you could take research methods and apply it to a multitude of industries and sectors. Now, do you remember Kudal? We talked about Kudal and our friend Joe, and he was stumped and he was about to give up. But he had this conversation with his sister-in-law, whose name was Kay. And Kay was a teacher. And at the dinner table, they were sitting and he was talking about Kudal. And Kay had mentioned to Joe that, hey, as a teacher, some of her and her colleagues, what they did was they took Kudal, which was this putty material, and a little bit of food coloring, and they would add food coloring to this kind of putty material, and they would give it to the kids to make little ornaments and little figurines, because they realized that kids' hands are very weak and they're small and they're not strong. And the molding clay that was there at the time was pretty hard. You know what I'm talking about. It's like wet and it's kind of like a cementy substance. And so sure enough, convinced Joe to change directions and embrace what these teachers were doing. And of course, we have the invention of Play-Doh. So Play-Doh emerges as exactly the same formula with some food coloring that kids would go on and play with. And now 2 billion cans have sold of Play-Doh since then. Now, over time, they've had to change the ingredients to make it a little bit safer, but you can imagine in the old days, in the 1950s, they weren't really worried about toxic, right? I'm sure there was a lot of kids getting sick by putting it in their mouth, but it became a big thing. And it wouldn't have happened by him sitting in his office. It was looking at how someone else adapted the product to a need that they were having, and his openness to that allowed for that kind of moment, that business innovation to happen. And really what it comes down to is people aren't binary. So if he went to everyone and said, do you find Kudal useful? Maybe they would say yes, maybe they would say no. And surveys often do this, right? They have these binary questions that we ask in surveys. And surveys are great for validation, but oftentimes for discovering insights and human latent behaviors, they fall short because we don't know what people are thinking when they say something. For example, if I feel something, I might say something different. Now, let me give you an example. Everyone here at some point or now is in a relationship, whether that's with a significant other, whether that's with your children or your parents or a friend. And you might have noticed them sitting on a couch and them saying, they're looking kind of a little bit down, and you go up to them and you ask them a very clear question. Are you doing okay? And of course, their response might be, I'm fine. Those two brutal words. Yeah, I'm fine. Now, as a logical human being, you've asked the question and you're getting a response. And if you stop there, and I don't know if you've experienced it, that's a ding to your relationship, because they're saying I'm fine isn't really I'm fine. They're feeling, no, I'm not doing fine. I feel insecure, or someone said something that hurt my feelings, or, oh my gosh, I'm stressed out of my mind, but they're saying I'm fine. So if we stop with the binary questions, we don't actually get rich results. And I want to share with you that there's a few methods that we employ to kind of work around some of these obvious binary close-ended questions. So I can pause there. I think before we jump into the process, I want to know if there are any outstanding questions at the high level, because we're going to jump in and talk about some of those methodologies and how you might use them.
Hi, Sina. There is one question from Boj Hajhai, Bhutan. He's asking, what is the difference between design thinking and divergent thinking?
Yeah, so there's a lot of methodologies, and I should have said this at the outset, is they're very similar. This is an article that I think I read in a Harvard Business Review about someone saying like, oh, well, divergent thinking had been there for quite some time. And I think they're very similar, actually. So a lot of the methods are similar, especially with the idea of going broad first. They call it flare out and then flaring in. So you're right to I noticed that there are similarities. Also, there's other methodologies, like for those in the development space, action research or participatory research. These are very similar concepts of getting people involved, stakeholders involved in the process of producing the knowledge that they're collecting. The purpose of this really is to bring people into the process.
Thanks, Ina. There is another question from Paula Gallo. She's saying, I'm interested in how you adapt this process when you aren't trying to sell a product. What are the key differences?
Yeah, I think for me and for many of my colleagues who are designers who've been doing this for decades, there isn't. A designer's pure driving force is to solve a problem. So if it's about retention, for example, of university students, that is the goal, right? So the goal is to meet that latent need or to solve that problem. And so ultimately you want to have results, and sometimes it's selling things, but that's just a byproduct, right? That's a business need. That would be the bucket around, hey, will people actually buy this thing? But design thinking itself is, do people actually want this, and does this actually benefit what they're looking for? And just like other methodologies, I use this for science. Like if someone were to say, oh, science is a horrible thing because look, there's an atomic bomb, and look at all these chemicals that they put on plants, and there's GMOs, like that would be a false representation of what science is, right? That science is being used to produce those things. So there's a motive there, there's a business motive there. So I think the motives do matter of why you're doing it, and therefore you can use methodologies to serve those motives. But if you divorce it, really at the heart of design thinking, it's just to solve that problem.
All right, thanks, Sina. And now we received a question from Azel Dorambayeva from Kyrgyzstan, and I'll ask her to make her question orally, please.
Hi, Sina. I'm Azel Dorambayeva from Kyrgyzstan. I have some experience with design thinking, so that's why probably my question, actually I have two questions, are a bit specific, so you can address them now or maybe a bit later. So the first one is about innovation in the education field. Usually it takes longer to maybe have a clear value added impact to kind of be proven. So from your experience, how long does it take to really iterate or adapt a solution before it can be regarded as the one that is most relevant? And the other question is about M&E tools in design thinking. Are they similar to the traditional ones, or is there like a specific M&E approach that should be applied to track solutions? Thank you.
Okay, I'll ask for clarification on the second one, but the first one is, it's hard. I wish I can give you an answer about how long it takes. I think the challenge with, I'll call them regulatory spaces. So spaces where there's a lot of regulations with health is one of these, government is another one, banking is another one. It's really hard. It's hard to say that something sticks because there's a lot of roadblocks along the way. And that's where, that's why stakeholder engagement is so important, that you want leaders in the organization to be part of this process as much as you want the participants to be, so that they can see by the time you come up with like a few concepts that you want to prototype, they've seen how you got in there. They've heard it. They've heard that people want these. And really in design thinking, we rely a lot on stories and qualitative research, right? Because at the end of it, our research isn't there to validate. That's later down in the line. We do a little bit of testing of, like, if you want to call it like adoption or quality, and we tweak it. But in the beginning, it's all about surfacing those insights. And when you share those insights with all those involved, and you kind of get a little bit of understanding around that, then the solutions make a little bit more sense. It's not someone sitting in a vacuum, and it's not me search, right? It's not like, hey, this is my idea and I want to make it work and I want to push it out there. It's like, no, this is an idea that we were building on the insights from what we found out from the field. And so hopefully the connection between people, what people want and need, and what the design solution is very closely linked. That's one. But in the education space, it is tricky. And I think the thing that I have seen work in the school systems that we have worked on is that usually there are administrators that are part of this process that have a stake in the outcomes. But yeah, I mean, I don't need to tell you that there's a big issue with churn in policies. And I think that has to do with political agendas and other things. As far as your second one, I'm not sure what you mean by traditional. Maybe, did you say MIA? Is that what I heard?
Sorry,
Research?
monitoring and evaluation tools.
Monitoring
The reason
evaluation
I'm
tools,
asking is that I work for Aga Khan Foundation, and we are applying, we're actually studying a Schools 2030 program. It's a 10-year research program that applies design thinking. And since we have 100 schools to be working with, it means that they might come up with 100 solutions. So the greatest challenge is how to track those solutions to kind of prove that they really work. That's why I was asking those two questions.
No, that makes sense.
Thanks.
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think like any undertaking, having clear goals and measures is definitely important. And I think design thinking pairs with other methods. So I don't think of it as it's not a dichotomous methodology where you're like, oh, we only can use design thinking and no other methods ever existed before this and after this that are useful. Like, so I just want to make clear that the best practitioners of design thinking actually draw on other methodologies and also expertise that exists in the field. So if someone is looking at innovating in the health industry, for example, they look at the research that's there and they look at how people have measured success and what are the objectives of it, and they pair that with design thinking. So it's very tempting to just say, let's come up with a bunch of ideas and try them and see what happens. But having clear measures of like, well, how are we going to select which ideas work or not? Those are important. But I think there's a little bit of identifying that at the high level, and then specifically, what evidence do you need to see to kind of give something credibility to then invest a little bit more. So in your case, I would say if someone, I mean, I'm just going to make up something. If someone gave me $10 to invest in an idea, like traditionally people would spend a lot of time researching, and then invest $10 in one idea that they think is the best, right? And it's really abstract. In design thinking, it's like, okay, well, let's take that $10, let's take $5 and give $1 to each person to do a very low, scrappy version of that. Let's see what we've learned from that. So it's really the first iteration is just to learn. It's not even to validate yet, to see, is that a good idea? It's to actually see it working in practice. And to say, okay, if we were to do a second round of designs, what can we learn from those? And then let's put a little bit more money into a few of those ideas. And then let's proceed to invest big time in scaling it. So there is in the beginning, it's a much slower process. It's a discovery process before you go into, and you might have heard of methods like Agile, which is used in tech world, which is they're there to kind of validate and to kind of iterate.
Thanks so much. I'm glad this session is being recorded to revisit it, and I'll keep you updated if you're interested. Thanks a lot.
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks, Ina.
Okay.
We also received an interesting question from Emily very shortly, if I may. So Emily Gagnon from IAP has asked us, can we replace the business concept with sustainable solution?
Sure. I mean, this is for you to use. I think you have to change it. Like a lot of times, those buckets. You mean for those? I imagine you meant those buckets. And I think, yeah, I've seen some people say viable, feasible, and desirable remains desirable. So absolutely. Like a lot of the work that we do, like I've done this with the Department of Labor in the United States as well. So you can imagine they don't like commercial terminology either. And I think really 100% you can do that. Go for it. Like you don't need permission. Just go ahead and do that. Yeah. Should we proceed? And maybe I see some of these questions that are specific to education. Hopefully some of them we answered in some of the illustrations that we have. That's okay with you guys. I'll move on. And I'll try to slow down. We're trying to get through a lot of content. Okay, so let's jump in and talk about the inspiration phase, or what we call the exploration phase. And this consists of two things. One is gathering as much information as possible, and then interpreting that information to come up with insights that we would use as anchors to create concepts around. So there are a few kind of instruments that are very popular. There's many instruments. And in fact, hopefully I'll give you a couple of links to sites that talk about these methodologies and how to actually execute them in the field. It's a free resource. It's a free online resource that has a step-by-step guide with templates and things like this. It's called the Design Thinking Toolkit. But I just thought I'd share with you three major ones that pretty much are always associated with design research. And you can replace design research with other kind of research. the reason why I distinguish this here is because as a designer who wants to come up with a solution, you want to take a step back and gather as much insights as possible. So the first one, which I won't spend too much time on, because I imagine people here have tremendous amounts of experience in, is interviews. Now, I would love to replace interviews with conversations. And the reason why I say that is one who has done formal interviews and one who has done informal interviews or discussions, I've seen the difference. What we find is that a lot of people, when you go in a formal setting and you're asking interview questions and you just jump right in, is people start having that relationship with you. You are the interviewer, I'm the interviewee, and then I don't know what it is about human behavior, but we want to please people, right? So either I will be a complete contrarian because I think that makes it interesting, or I'm trying to give you the answer that you're looking for in some way or another. And that's really dangerous as a designer, because you don't want to feel good about yourself. That's not the point. The point is not to start a questionnaire by saying, hey, if I gave you classrooms that had a lot of colors, would you like it? You know, because I'm leading the question, and secondly, like, I'm already planting what I want them to focus on. So I highly recommend starting broad when we do interviews. They talk about their lives, make it more of a conversation, because if there's a safe environment, they were more likely to open up. There's a temptation to want to, if you have an hour interview, to maximize that hour and get as many questions as possible. But what happens is it ends up being pretty flat, and it's probably something you could probably do with a survey anyway. So the other one I would say is have open-ended questions. Don't ask yes or no questions, but ask open-ended questions. Ask them words like, how did you do it? Or how did that make you feel? And tell me more about that. These are things that and ethnographers and anthropologists are great at this specifically, but there's others too who are in the development space who really, you start to learn that you just need to have a conversation, because the topic at hand is important, but sometimes an indirect topic gets you to the heart of that topic. So another thing that I would recommend is to get specific. Like, in other words, if they say, I love education, and you're like, tell me about the last time you were in a classroom and what that looked like. Let them tell you in concrete terms what happened, because we're really trying to get smarter with asking better questions. So we want to get their input. Go visual. So this is one of the ones that I wish I knew about earlier on in my career, which is the human mind works very, very logically because we're kind of trained it that way, right? Like, I will ask you a question, you will give me an abstract response. But when you go visual, you're starting to activate parts of your brain that kind of circumvent the I'm supposed to say this, right? So in this picture, this is a project that IDEO.org did in Kenya, actually had to do with education around contraceptives. And so instead of asking direct questions about this, which was a very sensitive topic, there was a lot of what they call visual cards, you know, like, hey, how did you feel when this happened? And there's an assortment of cards with different images, and they were able to just point to one, you know, so it was a little bit more of an emotional reaction. And then the researcher was able to ask questions based on that response. And so the last thing I'll say is also ask them to show you. If they say, the most important thing is my kids, you know, take a moment to say, hey, do you have any pictures of your children with you? Again, making it into a conversation opens it up to getting more rich, more unobvious answers. So one of the projects that I had an opportunity to work with was on Inova schools in Peru. So let me give you some context quickly for this. Peru has 30 million people in it. 10 million live in Lima. About 10 years ago, there was, because of just economic changes, more stability, political stability in the country, in mining, there was a surge of money that went into it. And so there was an emerging middle class that was coming out of it. So expendable wealth. The school system, for those who are more familiar than I am, PISA scores were really low for public schools, almost on the bottom rung. It was absolute garbage. The private schools, of course, were amazing, world-class, but tens of thousands of dollars and reserved for the elite. So there was this huge gap where there was no quality education that was accessible to the masses. Now, this man who happened to be an owner of a conglomerate, he owns banks, cinemas, clinics, grocery stores, decided that there was an opportunity here to provide quality education, but that was also still profitable. And so he partnered with this man named Jorge Suski, who had this concept for a school that would deliver something that was a little bit more innovative, a little bit higher quality, but was affordable. The goal was it had to be under $130 tuition a month, because of some research they did where they realized that they had to cater to the specific audience. Now, IDEO was engaged for that relationship, and they were actually asked, hey, if you could redesign it from scratch, what would you do? Now, it would be really easy for people to assume that they were specialists and go back into the office and design a system based on a few articles they read and things like this, and then present them with an answer. But they actually spent almost 3 months doing interviews throughout the country, talking to parents, talking to teachers, talking to administrators, going and talking to the people who built the schools, talk to traffic people about routes and safety, talk to the police. So they talked to a lot of people about the bigger ecosystem that was going into some of these neighborhoods where this emerging middle class was developed, and how they might go into building things. And they surfaced a lot of things. For example, they learned that even though some of the teachers were not qualified to meet international standards of curriculum teaching, they desired to develop themselves, but they said they had no time. So there was this opportunity to introduce technology into the classroom early on, so that it created an ability for teachers to help pair each other up, to help each other out. So more senior teachers paired with more unexperienced teachers to help them develop. Children, there was a lot of emerging things like Khan Accounting was happening at this time. And so they were starting to introduce a lot of the free curriculum that was out there that was meeting international standards into the classroom. And we'll talk a little bit about this more, but now, like they didn't just come up with the concept and roll it out. It was 2 schools. They opened up 2 schools for the first full year, and they used that as a learning lab. Those schools were basically learning labs of like, if we tried this, what would happen? If we tried that, what would happen? And there is a little bit of, obviously there was a lot of caution involved because there's ethics involved in this, which it's a whole different conversation. But it was only after doing it for a year that they then said, okay, let's scale to 4 schools, and then so on and so forth. And now they're over something like 80, close to 80 schools now in Peru, as well as now that same model has been adapted to the context of Mexico, and they're opening up Innova schools in Mexico. So one of my favorite methodologies, and this might be the most novel one, to be honest, that comes out of design thinking, is called analogous research. So analogous research is a concept of, you have an industry or a specific problem in mind, for example, in our case, education, and you might think of it, I'm gonna come up with one just on the spot, admissions. Let's say the admission process into high school or universities is our challenge. Now, typically what we might do is look at best practices, right? We'll look at other schools, maybe even in other locations, and figure out what are best practices going on in the world in admission into universities and high schools. Analogous research begs the question, is there another industry that has a similar situation, that they're going through a similar experience of it's difficult to get people to like actually go through the process in a way that they feel empowered, it's clear, it's smooth, that's not in education. So they might look at, they're like, okay, well, what about, it might be really radical things too. Like it might be like, how do people are admitted into military service? How does that work out? Or what do people do when they are onboarded into a company or like an organization, like an actual business company? Or perhaps they'll look at admissions into a sports league. So you look at a completely different context in order to kind of glean some insight. Now you're wondering, why is there a picture of a food truck here? So in the early 2000s, in the United States, food trucks became quite a trend. Food trucks are basically, obviously, these mobile units that have restaurant-esque kind of vibe. There's branding associated with it, there's menus. And the reason why it became so popular was because there were so many regulations around opening restaurants. Also, it's really expensive to open up restaurants, right? You have to buy a building, you have to pay for utilities, you have to hire staff to maintain that space. So food trucks, on the other hand, were a fraction of the price of an actual restaurant. There were not as many regulations, and people can move that truck to different locations to see where their audience that was most receptive to their food was. And so there's a man by the name of Josh Elman, and what he did was, he had this idea for wanting to open up a new school, a charter school, that focused on 21st century skills. particularly how to be innovative. He had come from both an education and tech background, and he wanted to understand, like, okay, I want to start this school where people, especially in maybe less privileged places, have access to these skills that are going to be really important to them, particularly digital competency and an innovative mindset. Now, he didn't go and get investors and open up a new school and ask for grants and things like this, but he was inspired by food trucks, this whole food truck movement. And he said, what if I created pop-ups and I tried it at different schools in different neighborhoods and saw where the most needs were? It's really cheap, right? I'm just taking it. I can create like a little canopy. I can set up fold-out chairs, and I can have an after-school program initially. So it's a really powerful way for him to test out quickly some of the ideas that he had around certain curriculum that he was doing. And sure enough, after some time of gathering that information and working with several schools, he was able to open up his academy. And you can look this a little bit more up about the Bricolage Academy, and really working with a diverse group of people and students, and how he was able to introduce these skill building classes. Again, this was because he took it from an analogy of food trucks. The last method that I'll mention here is observation, and this shouldn't be a surprise to people in the education space, but it's worthy of noting that you can't believe how many decisions are made in other sectors outside of education without even going and seeing how people use services or products and things like this, much less involve them in the process. One of the big ones is immersion. So going into the context and living in it and going through it yourself is a huge one. Putting yourself in someone's shoes is a big step. You can think of this as like actually acting as a secret shopper, so to speak, for like maybe markets, but also if you're applying to that university admissions process, you go through it as a student yourself. Try to go through it and see where are those moments where you're getting hung up, what isn't clear as you're going through the process of applying to a university and things like this. I'm using that as the continuation of an example from last time. Look for adaptations. Remember we talked about the Play-Doh example. It was people adapted that product to a need that they were having. So oftentimes when you go into a classroom or you go into a school system, look at the teachers and what they're doing around this, right? Like observe how things are going on and what people are doing to learn. Again, most people have the answer. If people have a need, they're gonna go meet it. In fact, one of the hearts of this was in my own study, my own research in my doctoral research, it wasn't so much, it was about how minorities meet their educational needs despite authoritarian regimes, right? Everyone has talked about conflict theory and how some authoritarian regimes suppress groups and others. My curiosity was, how do people go about meeting it despite that suppression? Because people will find a way. They will come up with secret classrooms, they'll figure out ways to assimilate. So look for those adaptations that people are doing, teachers, administrators, and students. Look for what people care about. As I mentioned before, if you visit people, and I encourage you to go into context, instead of inviting them to come to your office, go to their schools, go to their homes, observe what's going on, look at what they care about. If something is being displayed prominently, ask them about that and why that means something so special to them. Again, even though it's indirectly related to what's important to your topic, it may actually inform it much better than asking them directly. And finally, look for what things are missing. You can observe this through observation. If I go to a place and then I've gone to places and I see a bunch of empty cups lining a ledge that's there, obviously what's missing is a trash bin, right? And so, hey, that's a good decision. Maybe we should put a trash bin here. So looking for things that are missing is quite unique. Now, and we can get to creative ways of observing settings as well. So I want to take an opportunity to do a little activity with you guys. In the comment box, I want you to tell me what you observe in this picture. Now, I want observations. I want to be really clear about this. I'll give you one of my observations just to set you up with an example. That wall is green. That's my observation about this classroom. What are some other things that you observe in this classroom? With the teacher, the student, the way it's set up, students are sitting in groups. Okay, that's an observation. All children are sitting. Teacher is standing. Yep. Some kids are slouching. What else? Tell me other things that are happening, objects in the room. Students are paying attention to teacher. Interesting. Kids aren't wearing uniforms. Backpacks are hung on chairs. Yes, there seems to
The
be a
board
projection.
and also some visual things on the wall.
Yes. Not interactive. Okay. Okay. So I want to pause there. Thank you. This is great. These were great. Screen is blocked by the teacher. Sure is. Great. Okay. These are all great. Some of these are observation. Now I want to make a really clear distinction. And this is really important. And I know this kind of sounds obvious, but someone said kids are sitting in chairs, right? That is an observation. Well done. But if you were to say kids are uncomfortable, that's an interpretation. And our minds are actually trained, believe it or not, subconsciously, to come up with interpretations much faster than observations, because we need to connect the dots to have some meaning in what we're about to make a decision on. But as a designer, as someone who's going into design, you almost have to practice a restraint. It has to move back and just make an observation of what's going on without giving judgment. You're deferring judgment and just observing things and as they're happening. Because from that observation, you can ask a question like to the children, are you guys comfortable when you sit down? You see what I'm saying? Like, instead of making that interpretation and jumping to that conclusion, ask them, I see that you're sitting in groups. How's that working out for you guys? You see, it's a nice way to actually start coming up with smarter questions by just observing. There are contexts in which I go to schools and we ask their permission. So I just want to make sure that you know that there's ethics involved in all this research, that you ask them, hey, can you show me what you carry in your backpack? And we lay it out, and it's there to ask them, oh, I see that you have 3 snacks. Why is it that you have snacks? Or I noticed that you haven't eaten your lunch. What's that about? And they say, oh, well, we don't have enough time to eat lunch. We have to rush from one class to another. So there's even insights that emerge by just observing what's going on, and we ask questions that we wouldn't have asked because maybe we think it's irrelevant at the time. So from this observation, I just want to share, there was 2 things I want to share. There's 2 projects that we went in and observed classrooms. There's many projects, by the way, but there's 2 that I want to talk about. So this one was about, it was for a furniture company called Steelcase, and they wanted to produce a line of educational furniture. And so we went into the classroom and we were observing desks, and we learned a lot about this. So we learned, someone mentioned backpacks were on the back of these chairs. Now, anyone who's had these kind of chairs knows that the minute that kid gets up, that seat's going to come smack down because of gravity and pull that backpack and it hits the ground. There was no place to put those backpacks. So we kind of created this desk that had a space for the backpacks. We know that kids like to fidget a lot, right? To move. They're very energetic. So these chairs were made to swivel on purpose. Why keep them in these tight chairs for hours on end when just a little bit of movement actually helps kids be kinetic and actually be able to absorb some of the information better? We knew that there were settings that were collaborative like this one, and everyone hates that sound of dragging the desk and making a cluster of desks together and then dragging it back and making those rows. So we just added wheels to the desk so you could easily move it in and out. Similarly, this is an expensive chair. Admittedly, it's not cheap and maybe not as scalable. In Peru, in the Innova schools, they knew that they were going to create settings where the students were going to work a lot together. And so creating even furniture in a way that was actually collaborative was important to them. So they were able to source very affordable desks that were both able to kind of connect. So there were clusters of 6, as well as separate and be further out. They wanted kids to encourage to lean over and talk to one another while still respecting their private space. So again, it's very important to know that, like, from observation can come some of the best designs. No one sat there in an office and designed in a black turtleneck and black glasses and said, I have a vision for a beautiful desk. No, they got their inspiration from just observing and asking kids what they wanted from their seating experience. Okay, so I'm gonna move on to the next phase, which is ideation. This is when we've gone out and collected a bunch of information. We've done interviews, we've done observations, we've talked to experts, we've actually sat there and co-created our knowledge with the participants that we're designing for, and we're ready to come up with concepts. And there's three methods that I'll share, and perhaps the most common one is brainstorming, and I'll dive a little bit into that. So IDEO doesn't have many rules, and if you ever come and visit San Francisco, happy to show you guys. Maybe I can take you guys inside. It's a pretty wild looking space. Lots of Post-its, lots of walls. Everything is kind of crazy. No real hardcore rules that are there. But we do have 7 rules for brainstorming. And the reason is, as I mentioned in the beginning, when you're entering a creative enterprise, constraints are actually a good thing. We don't see constraints as a bad thing. It is within those constraints that you were able to innovate. So these rules, and you can find them on the internet, and I encourage you to go out and look at them, is brainstorm should be rapid idea generation. You're not looking for a fleshed out idea. You're not looking for a detailed idea. You're looking for a quick concept that might hit one of the insights that you've come up with. So you want to defer judgment of, is this a good idea or not? Is this expensive or not? Is this something that we can actually deploy? No, you want to defer judgment early on in this brainstorming phase or this idea phase, because you want to encourage wild ideas. Again, sometimes the best ideas come from unrealistic visions. A lot of the products that we have today in our lives, like computers and laptops and phones, came from science fiction novels, right? Because someone created a vision of something, and down the line we were able to get it. And the reason why we want to go for wild ideas is because we can build on the ideas of others. We maybe at least I'll speak for the United States, are obsessed with individualism and obsessed with, this is my idea. I'm the founder. I'm the innovator. But the reality is nothing happens in isolation, and no one person did it. Steve Jobs had a team of people to help him realize his vision. Elon Musk had a team of people to realize his vision. Walt Disney and all these educators. Freire had a bunch of students around him to kind of come up with his critical theory. So again, I don't want to take away from the person authoring something, but I also want to realize that in design thinking, it's a collaborative process. So when someone says, I have a crazy idea, why don't we take our classrooms into coffee shops, because that's where all the kids are hanging out. They're hanging out in cafes anyway. So let's have our schools in cafes. That sounds like a ridiculous idea. And if someone raised that in a brainstorm, you might say, I don't know, Daniel, that's a dumb idea. No, we can't do that. There's laws against that. The parents won't like it. Instead, you defer judgment. It was a pretty wild idea. And you might build on that idea and say, you know what? Why don't we make our classrooms feel like cafes? Can we kind of rearrange it where the lighting isn't as bright and it feels like somewhere that kids would want to hang out? Can we bring a sofa inside of our classroom? So again, building on the ideas of others is really important. And as you're kind of generating a lot of ideas, it's easy to get distracted. Everyone thinks they're like a genius in this moment. And so staying focused on what was your design challenge is super important. And then I'm not gonna go into all of these, but being visual when you're kind of coming up with your idea, even if it's a stick figure, is a great way to kind of capture it. Because as you come back to your notes, it's really hard to read 50 ideas on a board. But even if you have a little bit of a visual cue of what you're referring to, it helps you go back to it quickly and source it quickly. Many of you might have heard of makeathons, but co-creating with the people that you're designing for is super important. I've met people who said that one of the critiques of design thinking is that you have these designers who come in, they do all these observations, and then they go back and design something, and then they bring it back out to the people and they share their idea, but they don't include people in the process. And I think that's what I would call bad design thinking, or poorly executed design thinking. Because most of the projects that I've worked on, at some point, we actually brought the people that we were designing for in the actual solution designing process. Like ask him, hey, if you could design your classroom, what would it look like? In the example prior to this one, this is a man named Michael. He had been exposed to design thinking, and he had a brainstorm. So you see those post-its, he had a brainstorm with his students about how could he make his classroom a safe and nurturing environment for his students, given that he could spend no money in it, just the layout, just the pure layout. And from that, the kids got together and they created different setups. They created collages of how they thought it should go. And one of the big insights that came out of that, the research and the brainstorm, as well as the ideation, was, look, teacher, Mr. Michael, you're putting all your material on the top half of our classroom where we can't see. These are like, they were kids, right? And they're like, we can barely see the text that's really high up there. You have all the like the maps or the periodic table up high. Can't you bring it down to our level? And so he literally took the whole classroom and brought, and if you can see on the bottom here, brought all the materials that he would usually display up high down below, so that it was almost at eye level where kids would usually be hanging out. Again, it doesn't take a lot to do this, and you don't have to embrace it entirely, but you'll realize that when we're designing in these kind of ideation phase, we're not married to the idea, but we're exploring the ideas. We want to get them out there, and we want to do it in a collaborative way. Design charrettes are another way where you bring in all the stakeholders. So if you've done a project, a design thinking project, where you've done a lot of observations and you've done your interviews, and you come present to all the stakeholders, the insights that you've gathered, hopefully those people were part of that process as well. Bring them in the design charrette. A design charrette is when you bring in people, all the stakeholders together to kind of come up with a few solutions that address some of those needs that you've identified. I'm going to move along. Again, I can spend days doing this. And actually, there's a workshop that I do that I take people through this process pretty quickly and actually have people do it better than me just talking. Can anyone recognize what this image is here? You can just type it into that form and into the chat box. What is this image that you're looking at right now? Can anyone guess? Yes, some people are saying airplane, some people are saying wings, someone said a kite, Icarus, Kitty Hawk. Yes, these are wonderful answers. Okay, you got it. Thank you. Indeed, this is the Orville and Wilbur Wright, two brothers in the middle of America at the beginning of the 20th century, were dedicated to creating what they called the heavier than air aircraft. Now, these are two college dropouts who had a bicycle shop, and they would spend time building prototype after prototype after prototype of an airplane. They spent about $1,000 total to come up with the final prototype. And they would take turns flying this plane because they thought it was fair to share the risk of crashing the plane. And in fact, one of them did crash the plane and got very injured. But they knew that they weren't going to be able to design this thing in isolation. They didn't have enough money. They didn't have engineers. They had a couple of their friends who weren't even high school graduates to come help them build this thing. And they knew that they would have to do it by doing live prototypes, just trying it out and observing. Now, I don't have a survey polling thing for this, but I imagine if I drop the name Pierre Langley, how many are familiar with that name? And I don't imagine many. But what's funny about it is that Pierre Langley was very famous during this time, lived in the same time as the Wright brothers. He was the Secretary General of the Smithsonian. He had a big grant, $100,000 at the time, to develop a heavier than air aircraft. Engineers from France and Germany joined his team. The New York Times followed him everywhere he went. But again, we're here looking at the Wright brothers plane. And the reason is that they had many schematics, very complicated, high-end engineering that went into the engine. And they had 2 test runs, both of which failed, and then they gave up. Now, I don't mean to disparage Langley because we learned a lot from his research. But the reality is, most of the time when we come up with designs, and this is not unique to this industry, it's very common in education. There's some expert that comes up with a grand plan. Most of the time it's in the policy world. They then roll it out to the entire district, if not the entire state or the entire country. And sure enough, a year later or a year and a half later, someone else comes in and it churns, and there's a whole new curriculum that's put in place. And it's almost like a wasted effort, right? This intelligence and thoughtfulness that should go into it does go into it, but it's done in a kind of unpractical way. And so instead of like coming up with a grand plan and architecting it all out and then building it, what if you took mini steps of components of that idea and tested it out in different contexts and started to build it gradually and moving up in that way? So this is what we call prototyping. And a very famous term that we use is we say building to think. When we think of a prototype or a pilot, in fact, we often think of it as just the final draft before we scale it. And that's unfortunate because I think prototyping is the best time to actually make a lot of failures. We call it failing forward. Like you want to make mistakes. You want to kind of flesh out what isn't working as quickly as possible. And you want to do that at a smaller scale than a bigger scale. It's much cheaper, right? It's much quicker, and you learn way more from a design perspective than you would if you were to like roll it out and wait one whole year before you did a monitoring of it and then saying whether it was a success or not. Seems like really high stakes, especially in a space like education. And there's many cases where organizations have come to us and said, we want to revamp or we want to launch this huge program. And we told them, no, just why do you want to scale it so much? I know you have a huge grant. Let's take some of that and do a few little experiments first with it, try totally different things, and let's see how they do and learn from that and build it together. But prototypes can be really simple. Prototypes can be sketches and mock-ups. They can be temporary builds. I've created temporary classrooms before. We've literally taken a mobile trailer and made it into a reading center and tried it out in different places just to see what it would work. It was much cheaper than renting a place for sure. Make it a time-bound iterative cycle. So you say in the next 3 months, we're actually going to constantly change it just to tweak it a little bit and see what's learning and what isn't learning. Role-playing things, storyboards, there's a lot of ways of doing this. So I want to talk about a prototype that happened by, actually he was a behavioral economist in New York. He was hired by the state board to come in and increase the consumption of healthier foods in school cafeterias in New York State. Obesity was running rampant. In fact, everywhere in the United States, children obesity had increased dramatically in the last 20 years, and they wanted to do something about it. And so they said, if we can increase the consumption of fruit and vegetables by 5%, we will consider that ultimate victory. But don't get too excited, Michael. You're not going to be able to do that. But let's see what we can do. If we get 1 or 2%, we'll be content. So he came in, and again, he's not a design thinker, but he employed some of these methods, right? He employed observation. He and his team went and observed 5 different cafeterias, sat through the lunches, watched how kids walked through the lines, how they interacted, what food did they eat first, what did they grab, how much did they grab. So that was their observation process. And they noticed that the fruit was left for last, one. So the fruit and vegetables were left at the very end, and they were under these very unattractive bright lights, that kind of like neon lights that made the food look disgusting. There were spots on it and it didn't look really good. And it was hard to reach, right? You had to reach your hand all the way back there to grab the fruit. And so instead of, again, writing a big white paper on the topic and coming up with some grand plan, he and his team went to a discount store in the United States called TJ Maxx. And they said, what if we presented it differently? I wonder if that will make a difference. And so sure enough, he went ahead and spent $30 and bought some of these bowls and placed them at different schools, took the same fruit that they had and put them on top of the tray, and noticed the significant difference. Well, not only did it increase by 5% consumption in these schools, but increased to 30% just by the placing of the fruit in a different place with these different bowls. It wasn't a grand plan. It wasn't a big thing. And so this is the process of design thinking. And I want to pause there because I went through this very quickly because of the time that we have. I want to talk about the perils of design thinking and some of the cautionary tales of it, but maybe we can take a few questions now.
Yeah, thanks, Sina. So in the meantime, we received a very interesting question from Nana Sikstavi from Georgia. I'll ask her to pose her question orally. Nana, can you hear us?
Yes, I hear everything. Thank you for possibility of demonstration of my question. It's about teaching the process and creating also curriculum and standards in teaching needs. I think that instead of interviews that you mentioned in your presentation, we should create some kind of questionnaires. It's very easy to create specific questionnaires. I mean, in psychology, sociology, historiography, questionnaires, and etc. And it will be helpful us to make some kind of differences between these subjects and the teaching methodologies. in final decision, and it will help us and support for creating optional common curricula for teaching goals. These questionnaires are very much important in our educational system. I mean, in Georgia, in higher education, teaching, and so it will help us to create some kind of very important and very interesting new visibility of teaching process. I mean, creating new curricula, new standards. Maybe we can think about this, and we can make some kind of competition between teams, how to make this kind of interesting questionnaires in different subjects, maybe different curriculums, to create some kind of novelties in our specialties, in our professional to arise professional skills and professional interests for future, maybe. So maybe
Thanks, Anna.
Yeah, I mean, if I sum up your question as to use questionnaires as a process of helping inform, sure, yeah, I think that's a great idea. I think you just I think it's not about one or other method. I just want to keep away from being binary or being very specific to just one methodology. I think the point is, like, if you rely on just one method of gathering information, you're just missing opportunities to gain insights that are a little bit deeper and a little bit more informative from a design perspective. I find that questionnaires often are trying to surface validation, and I think they're very useful as a way of actually monitoring ideas afterwards, of like, how did this work and things like this, and how would you rate this, and there's all this NPS score stuff. I think those are all very useful. So I'll leave it at that. They are very useful. I think the qualitative part is I have found to be more useful from a design perspective in helping emerge insights that really feel more human-centered, you know what I mean? And actually, this is really important because it's hard to convince people of stuff. Data, people can argue data all day and question statistics and things like that, which is great, and I think that's great. But you also need stories that really bring the point home, you know, and illustrate it. So yeah, thank you so much for that question.
Thanks a lot. So we also got a very interesting question from Mary Mendenhall from Teachers College, US.
I know Mary. I know Mary. Yes.
So she says, you alluded to this a bit, but there is potential for human-centered design approaches to be tokenistic, superficial, and externally driven. How can teams and educators in particular avoid these pitfalls? What are the ethical considerations that need to accompany this process? And Mary is also thanking you for a great presentation, Sina.
She's very kind, so you should know that about her. So she's very forgiving. Yes, I think, Mary, I'm glad you brought this point, and I alluded to it. And now when I give presentations on design thinking, I have a slide on the pitfalls of design thinking, because as you imagine, everyone loves a shiny object, and design thinking is super shiny, and it's very attractive, and it's very sexy, and it's like cool, colorful Post-its, and it's about people. And it can easily become pageantry. It can become superficial in the sense that if you're not committed to taking those risks of innovation, first of all, I should say innovation is a very inefficient process. If anyone talks about efficient innovation, they're not talking about innovation. It's just not possible. You don't know what the right answer is. So if you've come up with a solution that works right away, the odds are you weren't bold enough, you know? And I think one thing that I really appreciate about design thinking is that you have to become comfortable with failing a lot. And I think the way you prevent yourself from being superficial is you set up expectations up front, you know? And I think there's a little bit of a commitment that you want from stakeholders. So trust me, I've dealt with people and clients from both private and public sector that use design thinking projects as a way of getting promoted, right? Because it looks really great, there's immediate results, it looks really good as a presentation. And so I would warn people that, like I said, give caveats of like, hey, we're going to try this process. It's going to get messy. We may be wrong, but we're going to learn a few things. And I think almost emphasizing the most unattractive parts about it and that gets people uneasy is followed by then the positive things. As a result of that, we're going to have more accurate data. We're going to really know what people want. We're going to have ideas that we know that are going to hit the ground running. And the way to spot superficiality is if everyone acts like it's a panacea. And I'm going to get to this in a second. So hopefully I'll address it in the next slide. But you're right. If anyone talks about a catch-all and they're trying to just focus on design thinking, that's a first sign that you should be cautious about. That if there's no magic bullet to this process, absolutely not. And I've seen it fail many times. I've done projects that completely fell on their face and it didn't work out. We did design thinking, and guess what? The results were horrible. It's just like any other. It's just like any other methodology, right? It's just to help us get to a solution. Sometimes that solution is another methodology altogether. Oh, you're muted, I believe.
Hello.
Yeah, there you are.
Okay, sorry. So shall we take a last question, or you want to move on with the presentation?
How about this? There's only a couple of slides left, and then we can open up to a broader discussion at large. There's just really one slide left, which is design blind spots. Now I've done this for 10 years now. It sounds like a long time, small and big. And these three things, I just want to point out because you know, even myself as a person of color, and obviously being a minority, I'm hyper aware of designers, just like academics, just like experts, bringing in their biases into whatever they do. And I would just caution you to be aware of your own biases, you know, whether it's gender, race, cultural, socioeconomic, that it's very easy to get into the hero complex of, hey, I'm coming to be a savior of this thing with this design, and I'm coming with these tools. It really is it's a humility that's what I really love about design thinking. Is it begs the question of, like, we are all learners and we're here to design together, and hopefully we can get to this together. The second one is the panacea mentality. Like, guys, it's not going to solve all the problems. It just isn't. Sometimes it's just like thinking about science. Does science answer every problem that humanity faces? No, it's useful for many of them, right? But sometimes being a decent human being is the solution to a problem. It's not science. And so just be aware that, like, it's just like any challenge that you have in your life. What's the appropriate tools to use for this particular challenge, right? So that's all I would say. I want to put in context. And the last one is operator error. Now, you see this ID 10T. This is comes from the computer programming world. It's a code for operator error. When a human writes the wrong code in, it comes out of that. Now, if you look, it also looks like the word idiot, and that's what it's meant to kind of make fun of. And then guys, there's a lot of people who are doing design thinking that, you know, we're all learning and we're all at different stages of capacity, capabilities. And so just be wary of, as you're doing it, be humble in your abilities. Maybe you got it wrong. Maybe you're not a great interviewer. Maybe I'm not a great interviewer. Maybe the person coming in is rushing you through this process. It's okay to question and push back and challenge a process that may or may not be working. So I just want to encourage you to be aware that there's biases. This is not a magic bullet, and this is definitely room for error and doing it poorly. Just like as Geeta can tell you, I've written horrible papers in my time as a graduate student. It didn't mean I was a bad person. I was well-intended, but I'm learning. And so we are there to give feedback to grow. So I just want to be cautious. I don't want anyone to leave here thinking that design thinking is going to be the new and the only thing, but it's an additional tool to put in your belt of things. I just want to end with this story. It's not an education story, but I really think it's a powerful illustration of how design thinking can have simple changes to big things. There was a man by the name of Doug Dietz. He was a senior vice president of General Electric. He was an engineer, and he designed this machine here, which is an MRI machine. It won all sorts of awards. It won engineering awards. It won design awards. He was praised by the medical profession, and people who were running the machine just loved this thing. And in fact, one of these hospitals, a very prominent one, invited him because they had installed 3 of these in their unit, and they were showing him around. And he was quite proud of himself, Doug. He was like, okay, I did good. I mean, this is what I came in to do. And all of a sudden he heard, he tells this story, he heard a girl crying, a little girl crying and screaming. And he popped his head out and he was like, what is that noise? And he looked out the window and it was a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old. She had a very frail frame. She was there with the mother and her nurse. And he kind of looked perplexed and she was trembling out of fear. And he looked back at the president of the hospital who was giving him this tour, the administrator. And he said, what's going on? He says, oh, we should go now. They're about to use the machine. And he said, I don't understand. He says, oh, well, children are terrified of this noise it makes. Now, if anyone's been in an MRI machine or knows someone, it makes a really loud, like banging, deep dunk, dunk, dunk sound, right? And you have to be completely still. So some people who might be claustrophobic, it's a very jarring experience. And he said to him, these kids get terrified of this machine. And so actually they have to be sedated. They have to be put to sleep to be able to even use this machine because they have to be still. And he said, well, how many kids have to do that? And the doctor and the administrator said to him, almost everyone. Well, Doug was his heart just sank into his heart, because here he was thinking he created this machine that helped tons of people. And all he could think about was this girl who was in this frail frame, suffering a really horrible condition herself. Her life was in jeopardy, and now he added to her suffering. So this is how he interpreted that experience. And he called his wife and he told her, he said, look, I'm really perplexed right now. I'm having like a moment of crisis of like, I feel really embarrassed and ashamed of what I've done. Like I didn't even think about these people. And his wife, as wise as she was, convinced him not to quit and to take a break from what he was doing. And so he took a little sabbatical. He signed up for, he continued to go to a program that was at Stanford at their D school on design thinking for executive leaders. And he said, okay, I'll take this as a break to clear my head, and I'll come back and see if I want to continue doing what I want to be doing. So he joined this program, and in this program, they did a tour of different kind of facilities. It's the classic Silicon Valley tour. You go to Apple, you go to Google, and actually IDEO was one of the stops because they were talking about design thinking. And they didn't just go to IDEO, they went to IDEO's toy lab. So IDEO has a toy lab, like literally they invent toys there. There's a whole group of people who are just coming up with toys. And they were gonna observe some kids who are gonna be playing with some prototypes. And as they were observing these kind of kids in this other, like this kind of play area, playing with some of the prototypes, he noticed that the prototypes were made out of cardboard, basically. And they had some engineering functions to them, but some of them had like old doll parts or old other toy parts connected to them, but they looked pretty scrappy and messy and like pretty much nothing. And he leaned over to the guy from IDEO who was giving the tour and said, I don't understand. These are like barely toys. How are the kids playing with them? How do you know if they like them or not? And he said, oh, well, that's easy. Kids' imaginations, they run wild. So if you just seed an idea in their brain, they flesh out the rest. They are already seeing this scrappy thing as a Batman, or they're seeing this thing as a jet plane. We don't actually need to put all the skin. Adults are very picky about that, but kids, they just want to know if it's playable or not. And all of a sudden, Doug Dietz had this big idea. Now, at the end of this program, they were supposed to do a challenge, a design challenge, and they were paired off with a visual designer. And so Doug Dietz went to the Stanford Children's Hospital, who had one of his machines, and said, hey, I have an idea. I'd love to try it out with you guys. Can I change just the classroom setting? Not the classroom setting, the room setting around this machine. I won't touch the machine, but I want to decorate the room a little differently. You see, what he had realized is he was taking that idea that children take a seed of an idea and they make it big with their imagination. And he got permission. He went through some of the process and talked to some of the parents whose children were going to go through this. And he says, I want to make this easier for your kid. Would you allow me to tell them a little story beforehand? And they said, yes. And he told them this story. He said to each kid, he said, you're about to go into this room and you're going to go on a pirate ship. And there's going to be a cook and he's going to bang his pots and pans as loud as he can to scare you. But if you can stay still and wait till the banging stops, you'll get the treasure at the end. And the kid's eye lit up and said, what treasure are you talking about? And then he put out his hand. He had a couple of those gold, you've seen those gold chocolate coins. And he had a couple of them. He says, this. And the kid got really excited. And of course, he took out of his pocket a little, a pirate like patch eye. And he said, well, you have to wear this though, because you're a pirate, And then, so the kid kind of got excited and went in and did the whole process, didn't need to be sedated, and actually was super excited about the process. To them, it went from being this monster trap to like a roller coaster or an amusement park ride. And so he tried this a few more times and then went back to that hospital that had given that original tour with a little bit more money invested, and asked the hospital president to try to retrofit the rooms to look a little bit more imaginative and to include this in the process. And after some time, the room looks something like this. Now, the machinery is exactly the same. This is no technological difference. He just created a context because he was creating something that was a little bit more human-centered. He leaned into empathizing with the kids' experience, and by giving them a little bit of a nudge, they did a study. There's a little study that was done. You can look it up online, look up Dub Beats. The sedation rate went from 97%, so 97% of children had to be put to sleep to use the machine, down to 13%, just by creating a different context. And the reason why I share this story, and it's really touching to me, is that we often think of innovation as really, I mean, granted there's radical innovation, right? Like completely turning something on its head, but we don't realize that even incremental innovation can make a huge outcome. The trajectory from this to this is huge when you look at the outcome, right? If I go like this, I'm just moving my hand maybe 5 degrees difference, but the impact is so big. And so I just want to encourage you, whether you're in development space or as an educator or as a researcher, what are small nudges that you can focus on and try design thinking on to just test out this process a little bit? Don't try to go for the big one. You know, that's like, as Gita would always tell her doctoral students, don't try to create your canonical work as a dissertation. Just get the skills of writing a proper research project and make it innovative, but you're gonna get there. You'll eventually come up with the big ones. So I encourage you also, as you're learning and doing this, to kind of embrace it as a learning experience and get curious about it. And I'm sure this team will share with you some of the learnings that we've had and some of the resources that we have available to you. So thank you very much for this time and this opportunity to chat with you guys. And I don't know if we have any time for questions, but if there are any, I'm most happy to answer any of them.
Shall we take 1 to 2 questions more, Sina, quickly? So we received this question from Wangpo Tenzin from Bhutan, and it's asking, design thinking appears like a curriculum model. How popular is the use of design thinking in curriculum design around the world?
Depends on where you go. I think it's emerging. It's become very popular in education in the last 10 years. And it's used to change education, but now actually there's some, if you go to designthinkingforeducators.org, they have a lot of resources for actually classroom curriculum that teachers can employ both for themselves, but also to help bring into the creative process. So it's usually integrated into existing subjects. It's not necessarily taught as a separate thing, but rather some of the principles of observation or human-centeredness or, you know, exploring by brainstorming. It's more like it's integrated into the existing curriculum that's there.
Thanks a lot. So last question from Hiroyoshi Hiratsuka from Canada, who asks, can you please explain a bit more about the role of evaluation in design thinking process?
I saw this question. I think it's a great one. So as I mentioned earlier, design thinking is really great at the discovery part of an idea and concept. There's another methodology called agile design, and that actually takes the hypothesis with ideas and has a proper evaluation, like a retroactive, they call it, where you stop, pause, reflect on your learnings, identify needs and gaps and things like this. So I would actually say that design thinking is paired really well with other methodologies that are actually stronger at the evaluation process than design thinking. I think design thinking is great for the discovery phase and the iteration phase, but in terms of proper evaluation, there are other methods that I think are far better. And if you Google agile design, or yeah, I think it's called agile design thinking, it shows you how both of them pair together really well.
Thanks a lot, Sina. Any final comments before we close the session?
No, I just want to thank everyone. And I think, look, the key thing is to be curious and to if you can take a piece of this, great. This is nothing sacred. There's nothing sacred about design thinking. There's no so-called design thinking Bible. It's tools. And I think IDEO released all of its methodologies almost 15 years ago because they realized that everyone should have access to it, and it's not easy to do. That's why they gave it away. They're like, look, we can give it away because it is not an easy thing to carry out, just like good research isn't, right? So I encourage you to, there'll be resources. I think you've already sent some out. The team here has sent them out, but I'll make sure that we have a list of some of those specifically for the people here. So Design Thinking Toolkit, if you want to get your hands on it right away, go there, and Design Thinking for Educators. Those are the two resources that I would highly recommend you go to explore, and it's all free. So it's accessible, PDF, you don't need anything, and it's in multiple languages too. So good luck to everyone who's curious and taking this on. And thank you so much for everyone who's organized this event. I think it's pretty brave to do innovation because it's inherently, you're setting yourself up for some failure, and that's a good thing. And I think it takes guts to do that.
And thank you, Sina. So on behalf of KICS AP team, we thank Margarita for the opening remarks, also Sina for such a unique webinar. It allowed us to stop and think, and for us to be comfortable with making the right questions and to be comfortable with failing, as you said, and to be curious. For sure, we all can take a lot to learn from our education system reform. We also thank all the participants who really enriched our session. Your questions made this much more useful for all of us. So this journey does not stop here today. We will have 2 more webinars in this year. So in the end of October, we will have ACER, Australian Council for Education Research, a webinar on using data to improve learning. Then in 25th of November, we will have a webinar on curriculum implementation led by UNESCO Bangkok. This is our initiative is supported by Global Partnership for Education and the International Development Research Center. We will make the recording of today's session and all resources available to all. This will be publicly available in our websites. We will ask all participants to fill out the evaluation survey, which has been added to the chat, but also we will share it by email. So thank you once again for your participation here today, and we look forward to continuing to work with you in further building our knowledge and innovation exchange. Thank you so much.